Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for you, and we have Emily Jashinsky. Sorry, I really screwed that up. In for Sagar.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to note, honestly, that it's 4:20 and we don't know where Sagar is.
He needed some time to cope, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah.
Come to your own conclusions about that one. All right, so in the show today, we got David Dayen. He's talking about the infrastructure package. We've got Ryan Grim, who has a big breaking story about commercial real estate and potential banking impropriety. He's going to be on actually with a whistleblower who uncovered this potential misdoing, so you definitely want to stay tuned for that. But we wanted to start with the latest details that we are just starting to learn about what Biden's next plan will be. So you'll recall, in his Build Back Better scheme, he was breaking these pieces up into two parts. There was the part that was broadly labeled as infrastructure that we've been discussing a lot about here. And then the second piece, which is meant to be more social welfare plan. So that's the part that we're starting to get some details on. We're supposed to get all the details before the end of the month when he delivers a speech to Congress. Let's throw Jeff Stein's tweet there up on the screen, which has some of the key measures that will be entailed in that package. So we're talking here about a lot of funding for childcare, funding for paid leave, funding for universal pre-K, tuition-free community college. And this is actually an important one, Emily. We have this child tax credit expansion. Now, the original child tax credit temporarily was included in the relief bill. And the idea with that was always like, well, this is really popular. We're going to do it temporarily in the relief bill, but we're going to pass it permanently later. They've scaled back some of those ambitions. They still want to extend it, but only for a few more years here. That's one of the points of contention. But in general, Emily, I think this is going to be, the infrastructure package is already really difficult to get through, and there are questions about exactly how they're going to go about that, and we'll get to that in a minute. This package is going to be even more challenging because, at least with infrastructure, Republicans are sort of like generally on board with the idea of at least the hard infrastructure parts. These pieces, there is even less support among the Republican caucus for any of it. So are they willing to push this through reconciliation? Can they keep all of the Democrats on board? Is their wealthy base going to revolt over the fact that this piece is going to include some tax hikes on high income earners? There's a lot of outstanding questions about how exactly they're going to accomplish this part.
Yeah, it all sounds good. And the CTC, the child tax credit, for instance, is actually something that's very bipartisan. This emerged from the Republican tax cuts bill that Donald Trump notoriously wanted to call cuts during his administration. But it does have support from people like Marco Rubio and also from like Sherrod Brown. This is something that actually can be bipartisan, but where I think there are going to be hangups. I mean, tuition-free community college, that will absolutely be a hangup, and it will mire us once again in this sort of debate about, bringing like redistribution. We're going to be back in that debate when we're going to have a serious debate about pre-K. That's going to be a big one. These are going to be big sticking points for Republicans, and so while a lot of this sounds kind of anodyne on the surface, there is also a lot for Republicans to pick out and to rile up. I'm saying this as a conservative, to rile up the base about, especially when you're looking at government. I don't want to say takeover because that's not correct. It would be the creation of new programs, but new infrastructure created for government to oversee childhood education. And especially as we're seeing all these debates about the education system right now, while parents are overseeing Zoom school and learning all about the curriculums that we've seen from some public schools, that's going to be a very big debate and a very big sticking point for Republicans.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, look, the relief plan, they didn't even bother to attack. It had like 80% support among the public. The provisions were wildly popular, including like the direct checks were the most popular thing of the whole, of the whole package. They had little room to, little to stand on really when Donald Trump had sent out direct checks as well. So they didn't vote for it, but they also didn't really say a whole lot about it. Infrastructure, they started to make a little bit more of an argument. They're like, well, this isn't really infrastructure. There's only a part of it that goes to hard infrastructure, and we're mad that Biden's not negotiating enough with us. But this one is also pretty popular, and they haven't really marshaled the resources to go to the mat over the infrastructure package either, because broadly when you ask people, like, should we invest in infrastructure, they say yes. And also, by the way, Donald Trump spent 4 years having infrastructure week like once a month. So it would be kind of hard now to be like, whoa, no infrastructure for us. Why would we do this? This one, I think they'll probably muster a little bit more of an aggressive attack against. Now, look, on the merits, obviously, I think there's a lot of really good things in this package. We'll wait to see what the details are. And I think if you ask the American people, should we have universal pre-K? I think you would get an affirmative answer. I think if you ask the American people, should we have 2 years of community college? Because the reality of our economy now is if you graduate with a high school degree and that's all you got, you are going to be in a very difficult place in terms of our labor market. So I think that would be broadly supported as well. The child tax credit we know is wildly popular. And like you said, was actually an idea that was kind of stolen from the right and expanded by Biden. So the individual pieces are popular, but I think you're right that it's going to come under a lot more attack, sustained attack from the right than the other pieces of the Biden agenda have so far.
Yeah, and this is also, I mean, these are really big issues for Democrats. Like, these would be huge, huge wins, generational wins, I would say, for Democrats when you're looking at things like tuition-free community college, universal pre-K, which I do think are popular when you poll them. Of course, that depends on how you ask, probably in terms of if you're contextualizing it with tax hikes at the same time. You'll probably get different answers, specifically also from different blocks, like the blocks that Democrats are now more and more responsive to in the suburbs. That could actually be a really interesting sticking point when they start poll testing some of this in the suburbs, now that Democrats have to be responsive more and more to that coalition. One thing I would watch out for, though, is that this could spur some really interesting conversations. A couple of months ago, we saw Senator Mitt Romney come up with this idea to literally just deposit money into parents' banking accounts. And so there's a ton of energy to be more innovative about these ideas on the right. And if Democrats show the will to push this through reconciliation, which would not shock me at all, because I think these are generational victories for Democrats. I think Biden, we've seen, he's talking to historians about wanting to be FDR, about wanting to be somebody who passes sweeping generational legislation. If that's the case and Republicans work with Democrats, there is the possibility for some really interesting, creative, innovative, like realignment type policy ideas that could emerge from this.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you know, I think that Biden as FDR talk's a little bit overblown.
It's hilarious.
Even though, look, I do think on economics, he's been marginally better from my perspective than I thought that he would be. But you don't get to call yourself FDR when you're talking about, like, I did a temporary child tax credit that lasts for 2 years. That's not FDR level transformation. And so it remains to be seen how hard they push to even get the infrastructure package all the way through. There's some talk about maybe we're going to take just the hard infrastructure piece and see if we can get Republican support to pass that through regular order. And then we'll take some of the other pieces and we'll see what the parliamentarian says about whether we can put those through reconciliation. So unclear how hard they're going to go on any of this, which means I'm very much going to reserve judgment about how transformational any of this will end up being. The tax part is really interesting, though. So with the infrastructure bill, they focused on hiking taxes on corporations, which, by the way, when they poll people on the infrastructure package, just like, do you support this thing? People are generally like, yeah, I support it. But then when you say we're going to raise taxes on the corporations, support actually goes up. And I suspect the same thing will be the case with this package, where the provisions on their own are pretty popular, but they're planning to fund it with tax hikes on people who make more than $500,000 a year. The rub is, and this is to your point about the interesting realignments that have happened in the parties, Democrats now represent, this is from Bloomberg, the tear sheet that we threw up earlier, Democrats now represent 65% of taxpayers with a household income of $500,000 or more. So they're basically betting that this very influential base of the party, because these are the people who are doing, you know, the fundraisers for candidates back in their district. These are the people who are upset about the SALT tax and why so many Democrats in New York and California say we've got to repeal the SALT tax cap. They are betting that they will care more about the sort of social welfare provisions and their liberal cultural identity than they will about these tax hikes that will be coming their way. We should also say we don't have any details about what those tax hikes on the wealthy will actually be. So we don't know how significant they'll be, how much they're actually going to hit these taxpayers. One of the things they want to do is just step up enforcement, because rich people and corporations have been skirting somewhere around $1 trillion in taxes every year. So just stepping up that enforcement alone would give you a lot of the way towards being able to pay for this bill. Of course, I think the whole idea that it should be matched as a pay for is kind of silly to start with, but that's the way they're framing it. So that's the other question, is whether any of this base of the party is going to bulk over the tax hikes, even as, again, I think broadly for the American people, they would look at this and say, you all did better than you've ever done during the year of the pandemic. And it's entirely reasonable for us to ask you to pay a little bit more.
Good luck with that messaging. I mean, let me welcome everyone on the left to this new coalition of voters from the suburbs. Probably people who were interested in like Tea Party ideas back in the day, because these are people who are responsive to the socialism labeling. Like, this is Republicans have evidence that some of these suburban voters, when things are successfully branded as socialism, will freak out. And it's not a really like hard and tight coalition for Democrats yet. I think it will be, but if you take some of these tuition-free community college proposals, universal pre-K, this is like the demographic that's probably going to be the least responsive to ideas like that. And it's possible, I mean, this is always a branding battle. It's possible that with the pandemic and in that context, there'll be something else. But these are like free enterprise Democrats, which is sort of a weird thing to think about. Well, I mean, it's not weird if you are in Washington and no Democrats here. But for the Democratic base, this is a very different block of voters, I think, than they're used to. This isn't super wealthy people. It's people who are educated and think they work hard and earned their money, and they don't want to. When you brand it in a way as like redistribution, they don't want to part with.
Well, here's the thing: this is a group of people that don't think of themselves as wealthy, even though they are tremendously wealthy.
100%.
That's basically what's going on here.
Or privileged.
And so I actually think I view it a little bit differently. I would say out of the Democrats' base, this might be the most solid core, because there's such an embrace of like a liberal cultural identity that's almost overriding every other concern.
That's true.
So it's going to be interesting to see, because on the other hand, to argue your side of the case here, these are obviously the people who are begging for the SALT tax cap to be repealed, and to which legislators have been very responsive, especially those members of Congress who represent districts in New York and California. So Cuomo now came out and said we have to get rid of the SALT tax cap. There's these moderate members who were saying, if we don't get the SALT tax cap gone, no SALT, no dice. So they're willing to draw a hard line on it because of these constituents. But on the other hand, so far the Biden administration hasn't been all that receptive. We don't know whether they're going to get rid of the SALT tax cap yet in the infrastructure bill. And we'll see how hard the backlash is to actually trying to raise taxes on a key portion of the liberal base.
Well, you just raised a really important point, which is there's a very important distinction between the cultural left and the economic left. And if Democrats can brand these proposals as sort of like cultural leftist, like this is education and in very soft terms, they can do that successfully in a way that undercuts socialism branding, then hey, that can really work for them, because that is a block of voters that is educated and sort of culturally leftist.
Yeah.
Very, very key point.
I don't buy the socialism thing lands for them, because we just saw an election with Trump where, the Republican Party went all in on that messaging, and the groups that moved the fastest towards the Democratic Party were exactly the people that we're talking about. Now, that labeling may have worked in some Latino communities across the country. I think there's more evidence of that. But to me, based on the political results so far, think about Georgia. I mean, that messaging was front and center during the Georgia Senate elections, and didn't work whatsoever or land with that population.
Great point. My only counterpoint would be that that's really hard to brand people like John Ossoff and Joe Biden as socialists. And so they were just working on an uphill battle to begin with on that one.
Right. But I think they're still working on that uphill battle. I mean, Biden is the president, so I'm not sure that messaging will land. But we are going to see, and we're going to have more Rising for you after this.